Okay, so today our speaker is Hugh Taft-Morales. He is the leader in both the Baltimore and Philadelphia ethical societies. He is the secretary of the National Leaders Council and a member of the American Ethical Union Lifespan Education. He taught for 25 years. He taught history for 25 years in Washington, D.C. He lives in Tacoma Park, Maryland, with his wife. He has 3 wonderful adult children. His hobby includes yoga, playing guitar, singing, and watching football, lots of sports. And take it away, Hugh.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Everybody hear me all right? How's that voice level? Is that good? Yep. Thumbs up. Okay, great. So thanks to Jill and Bill for inviting me and for all of you and for being here and Bill and Jill for doing what you do for ethical culture at Midway Rivers and across the movement. So thank you. So I'm going to start with some pretty obvious caveats about my attempt to explore the current violence in the Middle East. First, it's intellectually complex, and I am not an expert. Even for those with more knowledge and experience, it's not easy to understand and elucidate the forces at play in conflicts that go back millenniums, involving the overlap of 3 major religions in a land that sits on top of billions of dollars of oil, that's been a crossroads for trade over a long history of colonial and imperialistic competition, which is layered over with the suffering and fears of millions of people still scarred from holy wars and holocausts. So this topic is huge. I'm inevitably going to oversimplify and leave out a lot. Secondly, the current violence is emotionally and interpersonally heart-wrenching for all of us. I've struggled to process both the horrors of thousands of people killed and suffering in Palestine and Israel, as well as the anguish that this has caused people close to me and in my ethical societies. I mean, I've lost some members due to what they perceive as an inadequate conviction about who's to blame. So in trying to find both the insight and strength to say more, I returned to a childhood hero of mine, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and I studied a speech that he delivered at the New York Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967. It was titled, "Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence." And it helped me break out of my own silence just a little bit. I tapped his courage. Dr. King knew that his words about Vietnam would trigger anger and hatred, but he spoke. So in speaking about the Middle East today, I worry about how my words will strike some Jewish acquaintances who fear for both Israel and their own personal safety. I mean, there was a lot of sympathy for Israel right after the October 7th attack by Hamas, but Israel's devastating response has led to greater political condemnation and more anti-Semitic violence. So I worry about how my critique will strike those who feel close to Israel. But I also hesitate to speak because some will feel that my criticism of Israel is insufficient. One of my children was arrested at a protest for the Palestinian people, and I worry how they will hear my words. I also hesitate to speak about Gaza because it's just one of many examples of war and violence. I mean, there's so much violence all over the world, right? Many are speaking about Israeli-Palestinian violence or Ukrainian-Russian violence, but not a lot of people now are talking about how weapons are killing people in Yemen, the Sudan, Myanmar, Ethiopia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Haiti, Ecuador, Mexico, and other places. So I say, well, shouldn't I speak out about that as well? But I haven't. I've done little to alleviate or even understand the horrors that are in so many corners of the world. But I do feel like I have greater responsibility to speak about what's happening in Gaza due to the fact that my tax dollars are supplying Israel with weapons of destruction. Now, Thoreau spent time in jail for withholding taxes, which would fund war. And I worry whether I should as well. Another difficulty in speaking about this is that the dynamics are constantly shifting, both on the ground and in diplomatic circles, so it's hard to keep up. And I'm not proud of these admissions, these unanswered questions. I am proud about how the Baltimore Ethical Society's Ethical Action Committee worked with care and sensitivity to come up with a statement to send to the Maryland congressional delegation. I'm going to read you a portion of it. It read, "We urge you to call for an immediate ceasefire in Israel and Palestine. We grieve for the 1,200 killed during Hamas's October 7th attack and the more than 18,000 Palestinians killed by Israeli military, almost half of whom have been children since then. These deaths includes the relatives and loved ones of Maryland residents. Israel has cut off water, electricity, fuel, and supplies to parts of Gaza. Residents are on the brink of starvation. Over 1 million Gazans have been displaced. The Biden administration says that it has drawn no red lines for Israel's military, while the majority of Americans, including 80% of registered Democrats, support a ceasefire. We are deeply concerned that billions of tax dollars have been so easily provided to support Israel's military assault on Gaza, while we in the United States struggle for public resources to meet basic needs of our communities. We call on the release of all hostages. We recognize the right of Israel to exist and to defend its internationally recognized borders. We urge you to publicly and unequivocally call for an immediate ceasefire and release of hostages, to sign on to or introduce a ceasefire resolution, and to do everything in your power to pressure the Biden administration to do the same." Now, I was impressed with that statement. It was a couple of months ago, so things have changed even since then. But nevertheless, it was insufficient for some and too radical for others. So I wonder how we can process this conflict more effectively. So let me now turn to King's approach to Vietnam. See if we can draw some lessons. Now, in the years leading up to the 1967 speech at Riverside Church, King had spoken against war primarily because it drained resources away from domestic needs. And radical activists like Stokely Carmichael or Malcolm X demanded that King condemn the war more forcefully. Stokely Carmichael is now Kwame Ture, who has changed his name. But King hesitated, and he explained at the church that, quote, "Men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in times of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against all the apathy of conformist thought within one's own bosom and in the surrounding world. Moreover, when the issue at hand seems as perplexing as they often do in cases of dreadful conflict, we are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty. But we must move on." Now, King began to move on from this conformist thought and mesmerizing uncertainty when he learned about the horrors of the war, like the killing of children or the use of the chemical agent orange, which caused disease and starvation. And he said, "My conscience leaves me no other choice." He concluded that there comes a time when silence is betrayal. And though speaking up can be, quote, "a vocation of agony," we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak, end quote. Now, King spoke about the hypocrisy of sending Black and white youth to war while not allowing them to sit at a lunch counter in America. He spoke against the U.S.'s support for the corrupt dictator, Diem of South Vietnam. He spoke about the devastation of the Vietnamese people. But it wasn't until King called the United States, quote, "the greatest purveyor of violence in the world," that he was condemned for sympathizing with the enemy. Now, he tried to make clear in that speech that he was, quote, "it was not an attempt to make North Vietnam or the National Liberation Front's paragons of virtue." He understood that all sides bore culpability. He said that conflicts are never resolved without trustful give and take on both sides. But trust was scarce back then as it is today about the Middle East. Now, in both Palestine and in America, polarization is so deep, and it weighs particularly heavy on one young Jewish friend of mine. He assured me that he was a pacifist, but that after the atrocities of October 7th by Hamas, he believes that Israel and Jews everywhere must forcefully defend their interests. So he told me that there were people who, quote, would happily murder in the street someone they believed to be Jewish just in case. This was his view. And certainly there are swells of anti-Semitism in the US and around the world that are disturbing. Now, a lot of that anti-Semitism is linked to the rise of fascism in Europe and in the US. I read a lot about American anti-Semitism after Barack Obama was elected. I don't know if you remember that. But when this Black American became president, it provoked a backlash of white supremacy that also saw Jewish people as enemies. After Obama's election, the Klansman David Duke, you may remember, raged, quote, the Jews were in charge of the election. We had no choice. But it is better for us now because now we know who the enemy is. Now, I'm not going to go into the millenniums of anti-Semitism. I talked about that in a talk last year, and you can email me at hughtm@gmail.com for the transcript of this talk or that talk. But I will say that the very existence of Israel is greatly due to anti-Semitism. Zionism, the movement to secure a homeland for the Jewish people, picked up steam when Theodor Herzl and many other Jews were fed up of centuries of being targets in Europe, particularly Germany and France and Russia. And the Holocaust crystallized this existential threat. Yet Jews escaping Germany on the transatlantic liner, the St. Louis, you might remember that, were refused entry to Cuba and the United States. And even after the war, when most understood the extremism of anti-Semitism in the world, the British didn't allow Jewish passengers to disembark in Palestine, a number of boats. So for many Jews, the world seemed anti-Semitic and a Jewish homeland was essential. So this young friend of mine told me about this harsh threats that he had heard at pro-Palestinian rallies recently. Now, I believe him when he told me that he experienced hate speech and intimidation and suppression. He's heard others glorify violence committed by Hamas. He's read of neo-Nazis in the streets shouting, gas all Jews. Now, I know that the vast, vast majority of those speaking out for Palestine say nothing at all like this. But he is still feeling under attack. And I believe his experience. And I call on everybody, regardless of your stance on Gaza, to denounce anti-Semitism. Now, as I said, this hostility was less evident immediately after October 7th. Israel was momentarily embraced as the victim. But the response by Israel flipped the script. The suffering of the Palestinians is the primary focus of the world's sympathy now. Unfortunately, when people point out the devastation of Gaza and the deaths of thousands of Palestinian children and women and non-combatants, they're often accused of anti-Semitism. So I wondered what drives that response? Is it unreasonable to equate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism? I think so. But again, under the shadow of the Holocaust, which is something that was so real for me growing up, I understand why some make that claim. And I think it's due to centuries of trauma. Now, ever since I read Resmond Meneka's book, My Grandmother's Hands, I urge you to read that, I understand better how trauma is passed on from generation to generation. It's based on new studies in epigenetics, and though it focuses on the impact of centuries of racism, his approach also suggests that trauma of anti-Semitism is passed down, particularly trauma caused by the Holocaust. Violence, dehumanization, helplessness, a sense of abandonment experienced by a generation of Jewish people doesn't just dissipate in the air. It remains in the bodies and the memories of survivors and their descendants. Now, that brings me to a book titled The Lemon Tree by Sandy Tolan. Tolan wrote about the wounds that were carried by many Holocaust survivors who made it to Israel. Some people called these people broken souls. Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, expressed a similar sentiment, but in a slightly more insulting manner, I think. After saying that those brought to Nazi death camps acted like, quote, lambs led to the slaughter, he described the survivors as human dust. Human dust. And he added that, quote, turning these people of dust into a cultured, independent nation with a vision will be no easy task. Tolan writes about how this led to a deliberate reimagining of the Jew in Israel to eliminate the stereotype of the weak, quote, squirming ghetto Jew, which was a term used by Ben-Gurion. Zionists promoted the image of the new Jew as an ideal Jew standing tall to defend Israel. And I appreciate the desire to reframe the historic victimization of Jewish people, but I worry that this contributed to a warrior mentality rather than a peace builder mentality. I mean, I love the slogan, never again, because I assumed that it meant a commitment to never let anything like the Holocaust happen to anyone ever again. And I think many of you hear it that way. And yet many embrace never again as meaning explicitly never again to Jews. So even that phrase is complicated. Is it a declaration of universal peace or a commitment to self-defense at any cost? And unfortunately, I think for many Israeli leaders, it means defense at any cost. So is the trauma experienced by Jewish people now being passed on to Arab Palestinians? And if so, won't this just continue the cycle of violence and retribution? And this is leading many to say that the more brutal and aggressive forms of Zionism are actually hurting Israel's security and the chances for peace. And that critique started as early as 1948, right after the founding of Israel. While many Arab Palestinians were angry over the UN's partition of Palestine, David Ben-Gurion insisted that, quote, the boundaries of the state will not be determined by the UN resolution, but by the force of arms. So as land that was designated for the Palestinians by the United Nations was seized by Israel, some Israeli officials criticized Ben-Gurion. Best known was the agricultural minister Aaron Sisling, who foresaw cycles of violence. Back then, he said, we still do not properly appreciate what kind of enemy we are now nurturing outside the borders of our state. Our enemies, the Arab states, are a mere nothing compared to those hundreds of thousands of Arabs, that is, Palestinian refugees, who will be moved by hatred and hopelessness and infinite hostility to wage war on us, regardless of any agreement that might be reached. That was 1948. Well, Martin Luther King saw a similar self-defeating action in America's aggression on Vietnam. He saw that after all the bombs, he said that there is, quote, little left to build on, save bitterness. King bemoaned the brutalizing process that goes on in war, that brutality sowed seeds of violence and hate for years to come. So at the Riverside Church, he explained, each day the war goes on, the hatred increases in the hearts of the Vietnamese and in the hearts of those of humanitarian instinct. The Americans are forcing even their friends into becoming their enemies. King continued, it is curious that the Americans, who calculate so carefully on the possibilities of military victory, do not realize that in the process they are incurring deep psychological and political defeat. The image of America will never again be the image of revolution, freedom, and democracy. but the image of violence and militarism, end quote. So isn't that happening in Palestine? I mean, Gandhi said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. So why are we continuing on this path? Who benefits from the cycles of violence? Who benefits? Well, not the thousands plus Israelis murdered and tortured by Hamas, not the tens of thousands of Palestinians killed, almost half children, not the Israeli peace activists subject to harassment, interrogation, and arrest, and not to the Hamas martyrs, despite the lies they've been told about rewards that await them in the afterlife. Now, maybe some of the leaders of Hamas are benefiting. They're not on the front line, by the way. They live in relative comfort outside of Palestine. Ismail Haniyeh, for example, a senior political leader of Hamas and chairman of Hamas's political bureau, is currently living in Qatar, in comfort. Meanwhile, support for Hamas is growing. Politically, both Netanyahu's coalition and Islamic extremist states, particularly Iran, are benefiting from the violence. Netanyahu may be postponing his own arrest and trial. And it's tragic that war often solidifies support for whoever's in charge. Israel's extreme right and Hamas's extremists are making peace hard to attain. Many of you may know the Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari. He said that peace is only possible if Hamas is eliminated and the Netanyahu government is replaced. I think it's fair to say that Arab kings and princes use Israel to distract from their self-serving autocratic rule, very similarly to how many American politicians use the conflict as campaign fodder. War and violence and the anxiety they create make it easier to manipulate citizens. And most obviously, war profiteers are benefiting from the conflict. And I worry that there's some unseemly alliance with all these groups, and groups that are hoping to realize an ugly apocalyptic biblical prophecy for an Armageddon in the Middle East. You know that group of folks wanting to bring the second coming. So those who are chasing profits or political advantage may be aligning with those believing bizarre theories and fanning the flames of war. So it seems clear that we have to abandon military approaches to solving the Middle East riddle. We need sincere and prolonged efforts to find a political solution, as many people who have worked years in diplomacy have tried. As long as those in power benefit from militarism and violence, we're not going to have peace. Now, could the United States have resolved the conflict in Vietnam politically rather than militarily? Maybe, but given the dominant Cold War mentality, very few US government officials thought so. But Dr. King said that American leaders must accept the determination of communist forces to expel foreign forces and end South Vietnam's corrupt rule and reunify the nation. King said that war is not the answer. Communism will never be defeated by the use of atomic bombs or nuclear weapons. King counseled that all sides must be included in peace building. And as hard as that is to imagine, I think that's what's necessary in Palestine. We need sincere commitments on all sides for a political solution. And there are a lot of Israelis and Arabs committed to serious and sincere dialogue. There are a lot of Jews that are critical of Israel, living in Israel. Many Arab citizens criticize Hamas. We have to stop both Israel's neo-colonial overreach and Hamas's and other radicalism on the other side. I think we need Israel to give up territorial ambitions and withdraw from the West Bank. Let the Palestinians have a true sovereign state. Because I don't think if Palestinians are not given land, the violence will stop. The heartbreaking death and suffering in Palestine will just haunt us for a very long time. So I always have hoped for a two-state solution, as I know many of you have, not all, we don't all agree. But recently I've come to think that maybe even a two-state solution is too simplistic, given the complexities and pain that run through this history. Maybe there are solutions that we don't even envision yet. And so maybe rather than advocating for particular solutions, we have to encourage more human dialogue. Maybe we need more grassroots relationships between Palestinians and Israelis. Maybe the power brokers inside and outside of the region have to step back and empower the people to work together who are actually living on the land that is so soaked in blood. That's really very much the heart of this book by Sandy Tolan, The Lemon Tree. I'll just share a bit about the book. At the very beginning, Tolan says to give up simple narratives, like the one told by the writer Leon Uris in his famous book, Exodus. In that book, he glorifies the founding of Israel and portrays Arabs, according to Tolan, as, quote, pathetic or malicious or perhaps worse. And the message that Israel needs to be secure cannot be all that we hear, however. The interests and humanity of Palestinians also have to be centered. And Tolan says if you just look at the history, it's far more complex and richer and more interesting than the simple narratives of good guys and bad guys. And this book, The Lemon Tree, teaches this story through a relationship between two people, Bashir Kariri and Dalia Ashkenazi Landau. Now, Bashir is a Palestinian born in 1942 whose family was driven from their home in Al-Ramla in 1948. Dalia arrived as a baby from Bulgaria to build a new life in a Jewish homeland. The home they settled in was Bashir's. 2 decades later, when Bashir and 2 cousins made their way back to the house, Dalia greets them at the door. And she opts for hospitality, not hostility. She invites them in, saying, make yourself at home. Oblivious to how that phrase might strike her guests. Because after all, Bashir's father built that home. And Dalia watched as the guests walked through the home almost reverently. She said, I had a sense that they were walking in a temple in silence. Now, maybe it was the semi-spiritual nature of that moment that made possible a real relationship. Maybe it helped 2 people on opposite sides respect one another and be curious about their respective histories, stories, hopes, fears, because they got to know each other. Dr. King at Riverside Church said that in the quest for, quote, compassion and nonviolence, to see the enemy's point of view, to hear his questions, to know his assessment of ourselves. So as Bashir and Dalia's relationship developed, the home built by one family, but occupied by another, became a daycare center for Arab and Jewish children. Now, it wasn't all rosy. There were misunderstandings and disagreements. Bashir was jailed 8 times for a total of 15 years. And his association with extremists shocked Dalia. There were years where they didn't even speak. But in the darkness of that conflict, the daycare center was a small point of light made possible by 2 people willing to have a relationship. I think that's what we need today. The hard work of building relationships across difference is very much at the heart of ethical culture. And it's also the daily work of a lot of groups that I recommend you consider supporting. They seem better bets than politicians and terrorists. They are an investment in peace building, not bombs and walls. Peace activists inside and outside of Palestine reflect King's words at Riverside Church. Quote, a genuine revolution of values means in the final analysis, our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Every nation must now develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in their individual societies. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concerns beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing, embracing and unconditional love for all mankind. So, check out groups like Combatants for Peace, and I'll get you or Bill can share on screen or in the chat these groups and their names. Combatants for Peace is a non-governmental grassroots movement that works to end the occupation and bring peace and equity and freedom. They're within that area, Palestine, and they're committed to nonviolent civil resistance and education to build a free and peaceful future from the ground up. You could explore Standing Together. They criticize those few who benefit from the status quo of occupation and economic inequality and seek to keep us divided, end quote. They advocate for peace and independence for Israelis and Palestinians, full equality for all citizens, and true social, economic, and environmental justice. There's one group I'm intrigued with. It's called If Not Now. That calls for an immediate ceasefire with a familiar but adapted cry, never again for anyone. Some consider Jewish Voices for Peace of the Anti-Defamation League too uncritical of Israeli policy, but they are left of center and may have better access to Israelis' leadership. So that's another group to explore. But let me move into my conclusion. I'm going to turn to the theme of love that I touched on right before mentioning these groups that ended King's Beyond War speech. And he said in that speech that the Nietzsches of the world often dismiss love as a weak and cowardly force. And maybe it is. Maybe I'm guilty of being weak and cowardly. But King emphasizes that they misunderstand love. It has now become, as Dr. King explained, an absolute necessity for the survival of man. King speaks, when I speak of love, I'm not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I'm not speaking of that force which is just emotional bosh. I love that term of King's. I am speaking of that force which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. King was killed 1 year to the day after that speech at Riverside Church. And many believe that that speech is why he was killed. Did this prophet of peace threaten those interested only in profits and power? The very last words he spoke at the church remain powerful for us today. Quote, we still have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. We must move past indecision to action. So I'm trying to, and urge you to, move beyond war and the silence that it can create. Let's speak and act for peace in the Middle East. Thank you very much. Bill, back to you all.
Okay. Yes, we'll ask him questions even if he doesn't know that we're going to. He knows. Any questions? I got a microphone. Don't you want it? Woo.
Really appreciate it. Thank you. And thanks for the history lesson. 99.5% of it I would agree with. I take issue with one little thing is that you mentioned Hamas martyr. And a martyr, in my reckoning, maybe generally is someone who's killed unjustly for their beliefs. And it seems like these guys have used the 7th century morality and interpretations of their religion, you know, to, among other things, you know, go on a killing spree of 1,200 innocents. And, you know, I'm firmly against the slaughter of innocents. I take that brave stand against the slaughter of innocents. And, you know, I would just kind of take issue with that term. Maybe we could find it. You know, to me, they're not marked. And you know, sure, they show some courage. But I wouldn't call them martyrs, me personally, but I appreciate everything else. And all of it was very true. Appreciate it. It's probably best.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Bill. Can you hear me now?
No, what?
Yeah, you can hear me now?
Not yet.
Okay.
Try now.
1, 2, yeah, how's that?
It wasn't physical.
Great, thank you, Bill. Excellent point, Bill. And I would say that sometimes words gets in the way of understanding. I think you and I probably agree with each other on that the way you defined martyr, being killed unjustly, in some ways, no, but most of the people who died were manipulated by leaders of Hamas. That's my position. I'm not sure, I'm not an expert, but I think that a lot of the people who died were victims of Hamas's leadership and the people who brainwashed them into that. But that set aside, I agree with your point that if martyr conveys some sense of ethical, an ethical pass, I wouldn't want to give that. But I do see those young people, and I see all people that die in war as victims of the power brokers that put them into that war. That's all. So thank you.
I don't know if you can still hear me. It's important to answer the question. What drives people to do something so awful? You know, you know, what would drive people to do something so awful? We fix that. And Israel has got a lot of culpability for it.
Yep. I'm not hearing. Oh, we got you. Okay, yeah, now I can hear you.
Yeah, this is Lee. I appreciate you bringing up that false dichotomy that if you criticize Israel, you're seen as anti-Semitic, because I think it's difficult to wade into this discussion because of that, right? So I appreciate you bringing that up. And the other part is, you know, as ethical culture, we're obligated to do something about this conflict, right? Where we see injustice, we need it. But this is such a difficult one to know, like, what can you do on a personal level? What can you do as an organization? And then you run the risk of, you know, the Baltimore Society putting forth a statement and alienating folks. So, you know, no answers there, but I appreciate. I mean, I love that you brought up some organizations to look into. I think that's very important. You know, the solution probably doesn't lie with the people who have power, you know, but that in itself is problematic.
Amen.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, guys. And thank you, Hugh. Our notes from our connection vaccine. One comes from Jill and Bill saying our grandbaby Augie cut his first tooth yesterday. So that is great for everybody but Augie. And then we also have from Stephanie, happy official sort of summer. May your AC survive and hydrate, and enjoy the outdoors, which I think some of that is hopefully you don't have to go outside because and your AC isn't working, because that would be awful. So yeah. Oh yeah. And then we We like to end our meetings with a quote, and mine, unsurprisingly, is from Star Trek. Seize the time, live now. Make now always the most precious time. Now will never come again. And thank you guys very much, and I hope you guys have a wonderful week.
And we will be here for the next 2 weeks.
And all right, so I hope you have a wonderful 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I don't know how to. Yeah, I don't know how math works because I'm standing in front of people. So yeah, have a great couple weeks.
Thank you. Last week is Good Sunday. And polarized works a lot.